There we are. Hello everybody and welcome back to another evening with Gŵyl Festival, a festival for all things in translation. I am incredibly honoured to be joined this evening by Robin Myers, calling in from Mexico City. Robin Myers is a Mexico City-based translator and poet. She's published several books or that she's translated for. You translate mostly from Spanish to English, exclusively that direction?
Exclusively. Mm-hmm.
Her books include Manca, Animals at the End of the World, and Cars on Fire. I came across Robin Myers through her translation of Ezekiel Zedenwerg's lyric Poetry is Dead, which I really enjoyed. And yeah, thank you so much for coming and talking to me.
Thank you, Caitlin. It's such a pleasure.
So how did you get involved in translation? Was languages something that you excelled at from a young age? Yeah, how did you settle on it as a career?
I'd say there are sort of two main currents there. One of them is that I've always loved poetry and began writing poetry fairly young. And I was studying Spanish and have a family connection to Mexico. One of my paternal grandmother was from Mexico. So I had also sort of around the same time as I was starting to write poetry, I was developing this real fascination with Mexico. I'd come a bunch of times as a child, and I desperately wanted to become fluent in Spanish so that I could spend more time in Mexico. And so there was a sort of interweaving of these two areas that I felt passionate about. I wanted to write poetry. I wanted to learn more about specifically Mexican poetry at first, and then more broadly Latin American poetry. And as I got older and continued to study both of those things, at a certain point, I ended up moving to Mexico. I had already been translating poetry out of love and curiosity. I felt it was a way, in the way that translation itself is this intense, close reading and kind of an assimilation within a certain text. I was exploring that on my own. And in a way, when I moved to Mexico, which was about 9 years ago, I came sort of without a ways to start making a living. And it seemed that translation was both something, I sort of stumbled into it in a way that felt I was pulled, and I was also improvising. And I started translating prose as well, which is now sort of the bulk of how I make my living. But it felt like a series of sort of happy accidents, as many things are.
So you translate both prose and poetry, and one of the things that I've noticed in my own reading is that I have a lot less translated poetry, or did before I started seeking it out really intentionally. And do you think there's a gap in the industry there? Do you think it's some of the nature of poetry that poetry is harder to translate because it's so often can more center around wordplay, and also the poetry industry itself receives so much less funding, and also, yeah, do you find one easier to translate, harder to translate?
Those are such great interlocking questions. I think as far as the gap, I do feel that way. I think some of it is what I see as still this divide between the prose world and the poetry world, period. I think that's something I've noticed in the States. I've noticed it in Mexico too. I think particularly there's this idea that poets read poetry and fiction writers read fiction. And there is certainly much more crossover than I think is actually talked about or acknowledged. But there's still, I think poetry is still in this sort of odd position where it's seen as, which it makes me sad. I don't think it has to be that way, but is seen as somehow more accessible. And the reality, of course, is that there is never any money in poetry. And so I think that market-wise is a reality that, then gets to be grappled with. I think that also just in terms of the publishing market, whereas many prose works they are translated when there is a contract for them already in place. And poetry, I think the expectation almost across the board is that you have to translate the entire book and then send it out, and good luck to you. And so I think there's that, I think, is a factor too. I don't think that poetry is inherently more difficult to translate. I do think it requires a set. I don't think also, I'm not of the camp that thinks that only poets can or should translate poetry, but I do think you have to read a lot of poetry, because poetry does, I think, on a formal level, depending on the poem and the poet, on a level of sound. And in so many ways, I think there are kind of tactile issues that you need to pay attention to in poetry that come within a form that is already in place, within some sort of structure. And so I don't think that that's impenetrably difficult, but it is a specific set of challenges. I think for me, when I started translating, I translated almost entirely poetry. And I found when I started translating prose that there were all sorts of other challenges about how to sort of respect the form and respect the shape and respect the register. But it often felt very exhilarating, like it was this sense of, I don't know what the metaphor would be, but it was a different sort of dance, I guess. But I think that in starting by translating poetry, there was a sort of obsession with what language physically does on the page, which I think is very translatable to the translation of prose. So I really enjoyed sort of making my transition in that way. But I do think, just back to your initial question, that yes, I think it is that it's such a leap of faith for everyone involved, including editors and publishers, to publish translation, that they often, I think, unless it's an extremely established poet, a poet that people already sort of have in their head, it's harder, but it is a labor of love for sure.
If you like, I think it's, if we go to like specifically your two most latest books, Animals at the End of the World and Cars on Fire. So Cars on Fire is a set of short stories that sound amazing, and then Animals at the End of the World is am I right in saying, so it's based on there's a 6-year-old girl as the central character. So is it a children's
Yes.
book?
No.
No,
And I think that's,
yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
Please tell me more about this.
Thank you. Animals at the End of the World it's a coming of age story in which the narrator, in a very subtle way, is a grown woman, and she is recalling the narrator's childhood as a 6-year-old. But most of the book, entirely actually, the book takes place sort of through the perspective of that child she's growing up in the 1980s in Bogota, and living with her mother and her mother's parents. And it's sort of her coming into an awareness both of the truly toxic family dynamics going on in her household, and then also the sense of class barriers. And she embarks on this very sort of fateful, intense friendship with the daughter of the family's housekeeper. And so it's this very careful study of this very young child's sort of grappling with these extremely adult forces around her, with ultimately really painful consequences. And Cars at the End of the World is by just to mention, that's by the Colombian writer Gloria Susana Esquivel. And the book that you also mentioned, Cars on Fire, is by the Chilean writer Mónica Ramón Ríos. And that's a set of short stories that take many, many different forms and use the voice of many different narrators, usually women, usually immigrants from Chile to the United States, or women who are in Chile. And it's this wild, kinetic, I think of it fundamentally as a book of protest about the ways that neoliberalism and the patriarchy and sort of scripts about how women and artists who are women, are supposed to confine themselves and refuse to, and find freedom both in creativity and in sexuality and desire and in love.
I checked, and both books are available for purchase in the UK.
Yes.
So
that's wonderful.
if anyone is interested, just give it a Google. You'll be able to find it at most major retailers.
Thank you, Caitlin.
They sound so wonderful. Were there any particular challenges with either of them in translation?
I would say in the case of Animals at the End of the World, the voice, I think, is when people use that phrase, deceptively simple. You know, there is a sense of childlike wonder or innocence in many ways, and yet there's also this extremely, on the part of the author, an incredible carefulness in the way that she introduces these sort of forces of violence and of desire also. And I think it's as a writer, that's such a challenge to achieve both of those things at the same time, to sort of introduce all of these complexities in a way that doesn't sound either overly cute in the voice of a child or sort of overly adult. And I think that I admired that so much in what Gloria Susana had been able to do, and that was a challenge in English that was an exciting challenge. And in the case of Cars on Fire, I think Monica's book has been described several times as uncompromising, which I think is always an interesting word. And part of what for me that meant is that she often plunges the reader into situations that are already very strange. And there's really no attempt, she's not, I think, especially interested in sort of explaining why they're strange. That's the starting point. And it's the sort of the reader, it's an act of faith on the part of the reader. And there's an accompaniment, I think, into the sort of the realm that is already transformed. And so some of that for me was about how to establish the terms, you know, to respect the terms really of what she was and was not elaborating on, and yet also to guide the reader to, you know, to sort of achieve that balance between clarity and an intentional disorientation, which is ultimately very beautiful. So I would say that about Cars on Fire.
Wow. Both of them were published with American publishers.
Yes.
And we're obviously based in the UK, and I have some knowledge of the UK translated fiction presses and industry. What's the American one like? And I know that you're working both with the US and with bilingual translators in Mexico City. What's your impression of the market, and who do you like? Who would you look at?
You know, it's really only in the last few years that I had started working actually more with bilingual presses in Mexico, and then more recently with presses in the US. And so I'm also still getting, I mean, I'm sort of observing as a reader and as someone who's really interested in the panorama. My specific experiences have still been, you know, fairly limited and are starting to expand. But I'd say, I mean, to use the case of Open Letter, for instance, which is a press based in Rochester, New York, that translate the poet's only literature and translation, and they were among the first independent presses to do that. And they've also been, I think, real pioneers in presenting the extraordinary lack of translated literature in the US. And the famous quote is 3% of everything that's published in the United States is literature and translation. And so part of an active effort to bring translation into greater contact with American readership. So I feel very honored to have worked with them and to continue to work with them. I think what's exciting is that in recent years, there are more and more really brave, amazing, committed independent presses that are either publishing also only translation or are making much more of a priority to do so. And just to name a few, because there are quite a few at this point, I would say Deep Vellum, which is based in Texas, Transit Books, which is in California, New Vessel, which is in New York. And so, yeah, I think there's a growing sense that this is that there's support also among, like, these presses are supporting each other, which I think is also essential and wonderful. University of Texas Press, I think, is another really interesting example, and one that's often maybe overlooked, and I hope continues to get more attention, and that they're primarily an academic press, and they're well known as publishing academic books, but they have this growing, really remarkable collection of novels from Latin America, and so they're you know, in the process of expanding that, which I think is very, very exciting. So I'd say that, sorry?
Oh no, I was just gonna say I just bought a book from them.
Oh, you did? Oh, great.
Yeah, Nelly Campobello, Patuccio.
Yeah. They're publishing such an exciting range of things too, and I think also contemporary writers and not, like in the case of Nelly Campobello. So I'm very encouraged by that. So yeah, I mean, I think that is something that I find really exciting and inspiring. I mean, the panorama is difficult, and we all know that, you know, this is not an easy market in any size of press, and in any time. And I think particularly right now, you know, independent presses and booksellers and everyone is getting hard hit. But I think both, I mean, the independent translation scene in the US is growing, and is also establishing really wonderful networks with booksellers and with other networks of people who are passionate about translation.
That's really exciting to hear. It's always exciting. Definitely, it parallels the UK in that these are all new presses. You know, your Tilstack press, Charco press.
Yeah,
Worked with a little bit doing so what is it like being, you're a copy editor for Charco Press, so there you're editing someone else's translation. What are there any sort of unexpected aspects of that? What's doing that like?
It's been a really fascinating experience. Charco has I think, a really cool policy, which is often pairing people who are translators themselves to edit the translations that have been done by someone else. And I think, you know, copy editing is such an intense task, and I've done it some before, but I think the experience of being a translator, working with translators, it's been nothing but positive and rewarding for me, in part because everyone knows sort of what the other person is up against, and I think, you know, given that Charco publishes translations from Spanish into English, which is exactly what I do, and other copy editors who often are Charco translators themselves. There's a sort of trading off, which I think is also lovely. You know, you're able to consult the original text, you're able to go back and forth, but it's given me a lot of respect and admiration, even more than I had already, for several of the really amazing translators that they have in the catalog, and also a chance to think about sort of the act of translation with another degree of removal, and to think, you know, sort of in sympathy with the challenges that each translator is facing. I've really, really enjoyed it.
Fantastic. I want to move on a little bit to your own poetry. So I did a little bit of Googling and discovered that you tend to write poetry, or you have written lots of poetry in characters. And I found a particular quote from a previous interview that I really liked, that was like essentially questioning why in fiction it's so accepted that the author is some degree removed from the characters. It's normally a character, you know, the separation obviously is always interesting and up for question, whereas in poetry it's much less common. So I'm wondering what draws you to character poems?
I think, you know, and many times when I have found myself in the situation of writing a character poem, it's because honestly I felt that I had come up against some sort of block, and that I was getting frustrated with my own habits, I'd say, and I was looking for some way to get myself on, in a way, in a technical level, to get somewhere that I was finding it difficult to get by myself. And of course, it's still yourself, you know, it's still you. And yet sometimes I do think, in the way, I mean, I used it as a sort of prompt, in a sense, not that it was being imposed on me or asked of me, but just as a sort of way to jump into something new. I think also, you know, I think of it more, and I don't have my thoughts very developed on this front, but you're helping me sort of venture an idea, which is that I think I've started to think about this in a different way now that I am a full-time translator. Like, I think there's something about the experience of inhabiting something that's both yours and not yours, that has made me think about writing in a very different way, and about the artifice of writing. And I think, you know, that with poetry, in going back a little bit to what we were talking about at the beginning, there's still this sense of poetry as this sort of sacred vessel, which, you know, in some ways, I mean, I'm obsessed with poetry. I think there is something sacred that happens there, but I do think also that there's still this very sort of romantic capital R idea that, you know, the poet is sort of overcome with a need to express the depths of their soul, and that has to take the form of lived experience. And I'm just interested in complicating that, and in thinking about, you know, how it is that we sort of invent structures for ourselves to think about. I had this teacher once who said something I think about all the time, which is that she actually said this to someone in the workshop, that if you're writing poems about your relationship with your father all the time, you can look out the window and see a pine tree and try to write a poem about the pine tree, and you will still find a way for it to be about what you need to talk about, you know? And I think that was so liberating to me, in this idea that, you know, we are sort of involving ourselves with ideas that help us to get where we need to go. And it doesn't have to be all about sort of sitting and looking at your feet or something, you know. You can go farther if you want to.
What a poetic way of putting it. Do you write poetry in English? Do you write poetry in Spanish? Like, do you write in both?
I write poetry still only in English, and I think that happens in part just because it's always, and this has become sort of, it's very clear to me as a translator too, is that, you know, the relationship, sort of the resources at your disposal in your first language. I didn't grow up speaking Spanish. It's different. It's a different relationship. You're more limited in a way, which can also be exciting, you know, to try to play with those limitations. But I think that especially in living in Mexico, living my everyday life in Spanish, when I write poetry, I really want to sort of know what I have to work with, which is also kind of a control freak thing to say. You know, I think increasingly, I mean, I have friends here who are from other places, but they've lived here forever. I'm speaking in particular about an Italian friend who writes in both Spanish and Italian, and his attitude is just that, you know, language is ours to play with. You know, we don't have to just sort of like, oh, I couldn't possibly, you know. And I think that's been a bit more of my stance, which is both a preference and a sort of anxiety response. But I have written some essays in Spanish and really enjoyed that. And I think maybe someday I will try to write poetry in Spanish, but it's, for the most part now, there has been that gap. And I've also been really fortunate to have my poetry in English translated, some of it into Spanish, by people that I've also collaborated with. And so I think also sort of out of respect and love for that process, I have tended to separate these things.
So you talk about collaboration, and obviously I know that the book that I found you through, Lit Poetry Instead, you and Ezekiel translate each other fairly frequently and seem to have a partnership. Is that unusual in sort of poetry translation, and what's that like?
I don't know how unusual it is. I think I know of many people who have. I mean, I think it's often more of a sort of long-standing relationship where one person translates the other, and there are other forms of collaboration or co-translation even. I can say, just speaking from this experience of mine, that it has been unusual. I mean, it's the only sort of friendship collaboration I have of exactly this nature. We've known each other for a long time. I studied translation with him in Buenos Aires when I was a student there briefly, and it's been a sort of a transformative experience for me, both in the sense that I learned and still learn an enormous amount from his vast knowledge of translation and of Latin American poetry, but also now in the sense of being able to sort of, I mean, in each case, when I translate him or when he translates me, the person who's translating does an initial version and sort of shows it to the other person, who then makes comments. But it is certainly a continual conversation, which for me has been extremely rewarding and fun.
That sounds that's really interesting to learn about. Are you working on any poetry at the moment? Are you working on any translation at the moment? What's your current work?
All of the above. One project which has been in the works for a long time and is in sort of final phases, it'll be out in the fall, is a book that's sort of an academic book, but also not entirely, by the Mexican writer Cristina Rivera Garza. And it's a book of essays called The Restless Dead. And that is coming out with Vanderbilt University Press in the US. And then I'm working on a bunch of, this time I'll talk specifically about poetry. A few things that I'm really excited about. There's a book of poems by the Mexican poet Isabel Zapata, which is a beautiful book of poems almost entirely about animals and the natural world, called A Whale is a Country. And that's, none of these projects that I'm talking about have publishers yet, but are sort of in the process. And I'm working on two Argentine poets, both very young and amazing. One is named Mariana Espada, and the other is named Daniel Lipara. And so it's been, especially in these very oddest of times, it's been a sense of a real kind of practice for me to be translating some poetry every day and just having that as a sort of constant companionship.
Do you do it in a quiet place? Do you have to really focus? Do you I know that sounds maybe like but I'm really interested in the practice of translation. Does it sort of feel similar to the practice of writing?
It feels like the practice of writing, but already being directed towards something. It's like a sort of, like there's already sort of an invitation you're responding to. It feels similar to me also, I mean, in just thinking even just about work conditions, I find that if I'm translating, not poetry actually, but if I'm translating prose, I often can listen to music even. But sometimes, I do need a sort of sense. I can work sort of with things happening around me, but there is a sense of a very intense focus. But before our current pandemic reality, I often did like to go and work in coffee shops and have sort of human noise around me. I've always found that very comforting. But I live in Mexico City, which is a loud place, so there's plenty of that even at a distance.
And lastly, to wrap up, do you have any books that are from Spanish translation into English that you would recommend people searching out that maybe they haven't? I know I've put you on the spot here.
No.
That maybe people haven't come across, or even better, if you had a poetry recommendation or two, that would be wonderful.
Yes, I have. The first two that come to mind are actually, there are three that are prose, and they're all by Mexican writers. There's one which is a novel called The Mutations, by Jorge Comensal, that was translated by Charlotte Whittle, which is wonderful. And then there are two with the same translator, who is an astonishing, actually Charlotte's also an astonishing British translation, they both are, but by Sophie Hughes, a very recent translator called, a recent translation called Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor, which is absolutely extraordinary. Do you have it?
It's just in the corner over there on my
it's so amazing. It's so amazing. And the other is, go ahead, sorry, there's a bit of a delay.
She's also translated An Orphan World by Chaka Press, didn't she? Is that right? Yes.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And I was going to mention another book also translated by Sophie that is a few years older, but I think it's just exquisite. It's beautiful, beautiful book called Umami, by Laia Fresa. And that's also Sophie's translation. And I had a poetry recommendation that was on the tip of my tongue, and I forgot. I'm sorry, I had the Zoom freeze.
No, it's not. If you remember, I'll write it in so that people can find it.
Okay, good.
So thank you so much, Robin. That was the most interesting conversation.
Thank you, Caitlin. It's been such a joy. Thank you so much for your questions and your openness and your support of all of these arts that converge in translation.
The least I can do. Anyway, thanks guys for listening, and tune in for the next. Not sure which night this is coming out on. I bet tomorrow is really good.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.